Good morning. Thank you for coming to the Metzler lecture this year. And I am Jerry Wu, Department Chair of Kinesiology Health. And I would like to use the next few minutes to welcome you and to introduce our speaker. Georgia State, as you know, is a leading urban research university in Atlanta. Georgia State is nationally recognized for programs and initiatives that help students from all backgrounds to earn degrees. As the cultural and economic center of the Southeast, Georgia State provides faculty and 52,000 students in its 6 campuses with unsurpassed access to opportunities in one of the nation's great global cities. Department of Kinesiology Health is housed in College of Education and Human Development. The department offers various degree programs in exercise, health and physical education, sport administration to nearly 1,000 students. The department's mission is threefold. First is to discover new knowledge and advance the understanding of the role of physical activity in health and well-being. Second is to educate members of society and prepare future professionals. And third is to promote health lifestyles through research, teaching, and service. The Mike and Terry Metzler Lecture was established by Mike and Terry Metzler in April 2018. Both Mike and Terry are retired faculty members from department, and they made tremendous contributions to the department and the programs. They established this distinguished lecture series to feature nationally recognized scholarship, research, policy, and the programs that promote physical activity for healthy living. The Metzler Lecture has become one of the most important departmental events, so we're very grateful to their continued support to the Metzler Distinguished Lecture. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Brad Wilkins. Dr. Wilkins received his PhD from the University of Oregon, trained as a postdoc fellow at both University of Oregon and Mayo Clinic. Accomplished scientist at Nike over the last 10 years, Dr. Wilkins held several scientific and leadership positions, including directing next-generation research teams and leading the scientific team for Nike's attempt at a sub-2-hour marathon. That was achieved a couple years ago. Dr. Wilkins is a leading expert in exercise and sport physiology with a passion for dissecting the physiological limits of human performance. His current research explores the impact of factors such as gut microbes, sex hormones, environmental factors, dehydration, mechanical and blood flow regulation on human performance outcomes. He has a broad interest of human physiology with a specific work in human cardiovascular control, muscle bioenergetics, and their interaction, which ultimately dictate oxygen supply and demand balance or imbalance. Today, it's my great pleasure and honor to invite Dr. Wilkins and join us to give us outstanding lecture on human physiology limits. Please join me to welcome Dr. Wilkins for the lecture this year.
Thank you. I made it up the stairs. That was the first goal. I think I should be able to start. Yeah, so it's truly an honor to be invited to give this lecture. I thank you all for coming, and thank you for that introduction. It makes me think about how my work and myself fits into this goal that Jerry mentioned, which is to invite speakers to talk about scholarship, research, policy, and programs that promote physical activity and for healthy living. It really, over the last several months, I've tried to think about, well, how do I fit into this from a human performance standpoint? Because that's where I spent most of my career studying. On a personal note, outside of the members of my immediate family, the only thing that had the biggest impact on my life is sport. My whole career is based around sport and my early access and the privilege that I had to have early access to sport and physical activity. And so that early access really led to pretty much every career decision I've ever made around what I pursue and the joy that I get from that career. From a more scientific perspective, thinking about this idea of access to sport, we know that a given individual is going to have physical capabilities that are dictated by their genetics, that are dictated by epigenetics. They're also dictated by their access to coaching, their family environment. Socioeconomic influences have very complex contributions to performance outcomes, some negative, some positive. This is an incomplete list of all the things that could be contributing from an access to sport standpoint to our collective performance as humans. At some point, this becomes a probability problem. When you look at what's the chance or the probability that a specific individual is going to have the optimal conditions, all of these conditions that we have in the background here, optimally align for that individual to have the best performance. I would argue that that is quite low. That probability is very, very low. The remedy for that is access. The more access we can have for individuals, the higher the probability one individual has of matching their genetics with coaching, with environment, with socioeconomic status, et cetera, et cetera. So that probability becomes much, much higher with access. There's examples of this all over the place. Look at basketball in the United States. Look at ice skating in the Netherlands. Look at cross-country skiing in most Scandinavian countries. The culture provides access to these specific sports, and those cultures thrive in those sports because of that. Another example that my graduate student, Mira Schoberlein, reminded me of just a couple days ago is that in 1926 was the first official women's timed marathon. Violet Percy ran 3 hours and 40 minutes for a marathon distance. The men's world record at the time was 32% faster than that. It was set in 1925 at 2 hours, 29 minutes, and 2 seconds. So if you follow the marathon, you know that just a couple of weeks ago, Ruth Kepinetich ran just under 2:10 for the first time ever. So for a woman. That is now 7% higher than the fastest men's time, this is an official world record. Men have run faster than that. They've run under 2 hours, but this is the official world record for the men. This is only a 7% difference. Okay? This is entirely, either directly or indirectly related to access to sport and access that women now have to be able to run the marathon, which honestly didn't really start happening in earnest until the 1970s, late 1970s, was when women really were able to start running the marathon. So this is just shy of 100 years that it took to get from 32% gap to a 7% gap. And men were at this, I think I looked it up this morning, 1896, I think, was the first timed men's marathon. So they were at it for 40 years before the first women's timed marathon. So imagine another 40 years of when women have access to this, how close these times can be. Just another example of the importance that we should be placing on access to sport. So I, for one, am very grateful for Mike and Terry's work on promoting physical education and access to sport. So another reason why I'm very happy to be here to talk today. This access drives performance collectively, and it's an important component of it. But I'm here today to talk about physiological limits, human physiological limits, and a career spent studying those limits. It was covered a little bit in the intro, my background, but I parlayed this love of sport that I have into graduate school at the University of Oregon to get my PhD. Then went on to work with Dr. Mike Joyner at the Mayo Clinic for a postdoctoral fellowship and started my research career there. I pretty much shocked everybody at that point and went and took a research position in industry at Nike in the famed Nike Sport Research Lab. I then, again, held numerous scientific and leadership positions at Nike. I founded the Nike Plus Sport Performance Laboratory within Nike, and we really laid the foundation for what eventually became Breaking 2, which was Nike's attempt to promote an athlete. Nike didn't run the marathon. We had athletes that were super fast that we promoted and helped try to break that record, which again has now been done a couple of years after this. And so I led the scientific endeavor for that effort before again breaking all expectations and leaving Nike in 2017, I believe, and I started my own consulting business and started to transition back to an academic career. I was at Gonzaga University, started at Gonzaga in spring of 2020. Great time to start a brand new job in academia, right? So that, as well as a lot of other things, contributed to my wanting to expand my research capabilities, and got a faculty position back at the University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon, and started the Oregon Performance Research Laboratory. And now we are in our second year and thriving. They might be watching, but they should be working at this point. It's like 7 a.m. So this is given me and provided me, or this career has provided me, I think, a unique perspective where I can look at science in a little bit different way than those that may have spent their entire careers in academia. I have a deep passion for pursuit of scientific knowledge, but I have a similar passion to the application of that knowledge and identifying and developing creative solutions to problems that we understand the scientific underpinnings of. And so I work in both of these spaces, and I enjoy working in both of these spaces. We're here today to talk about human limits. So just to kind of level set, when I think about human limits, we have to understand both human capability, or what humans are potentially capable of doing, understanding human potential. But to define a specific set of performance outcomes, we also need to understand all the parameters and the context that dictate that performance. Okay? All of the boundaries that are put or packaged around some specific performance. A lot of those are necessary. There's rules to the game that we need to follow, right? There's weather, there's other things, there's environmental conditions. All of those are boundaries or parameters that surround a specific performance. Some of them are perceived, like no woman has ever run that fast before, or we don't do things that way around here. Those are perceived barriers that are really not real, but they are part of this context that surround what a human is actually capable of doing. So it's very important for us to define the performance outcome, because performance for this power lifter is very different than performance for these military special operators, where performance in this condition has extremely high consequences, right? These Cirque du Soleil performers have different performance outcomes or contexts or boundaries on their ability to perform than Elliot does when he breaks 2 hours in the marathon distance. Okay, this is Eliud Kipchoge when he actually ran 1:59:40 something and change in 2019, which is amazing, by the way. And so those we have to understand all of the context around these performance outcomes to be able to really identify and then challenge and push those limits. So I kind of take this from an integrative physiology approach. I'm an integrative physiologist. So I put the human in the middle and try to say, what is this human capable of doing? So then we can understand what are these parameters, or what is the context around a specific performance outcome, and how do we mitigate or reduce the impact of those barriers on what that human is capable of doing. So I'm not surprisingly going to give you a running example throughout this presentation. But for running, there's 4 primary things that we see as being limitations on somebody's ability to run fast for far, right? That is maximal oxygen consumption or maximum capacity to do exercise, VO2 max. That is the energetic cost to run a given speed over a given distance, so that's running economy. And then there's the sustainable speed or the sustainable exercise intensity as a percentage of that VO2 max that somebody can sustain for a long time. And then there's neural output, or basically neural drive, my brain recruiting muscle fibers to be able to perform the task. Those four things are primary factors that are going to drive performance outcome for running. Remember, for that power lifter, it could be very different. 1RMs, being able to recruit all muscle fibers, et cetera, that becomes very, very much a primary factor. But for running, those four are what we consider to be the primary limiting factors. In addition to those primary limiting factors, there are secondary, tertiary, and quaternary contributors, modulators I like to call them, that influence those primary factors. Okay, some of these things can be muscle blood flow, cardiac output. We could argue all day long whether or not one's a primary versus secondary versus tertiary, but the point is that all of these things are going to ultimately contribute to influencing VO2 max, running economy, sustainable speed, and neural drive. As an example, environmental conditions, such as high environmental temperatures, that's going to affect skin blood flow, cardiac output. It's going to ultimately affect blood pressure. Dr. Wong can tell you more precisely exactly how that's going to happen, and muscle blood flow is going to go down. And anybody who's taken an entry-level exercise physiology class should know that a reduction in cardiac output is going to reduce their VO2 max, right? So all of these things can influence these primary factors. These can be mitigated. They are very complex interactions. Another example, if you take running surface or footwear, that's going to affect somebody's stride, can affect the mechanics of their leg stiffness, ultimately affecting running mechanics or efferent feedback, which is going to affect both economy and probably neural drive, right? So all of these things interact to ultimately affect these primary components. So in order to understand these modulating factors, we need to first understand the primary factors and then things that are going to influence it. But all that starts with defining the performance outcome. If we don't define the performance outcome, I'm not going to know what these primary, secondary, tertiary factors really are. So human capability, and understanding human capability is dependent on being able to understand that specific context, because what barriers are presented against this human that's keeping them from reaching their full potential. Because humans can be very capable, but we package these barriers around them and we're limiting their ability to reach their full potential. That's really what we're trying to talk about here today. So defining the outcome, very important. But let's talk about identifying human capability. Let's go into these four things that drive human performance from what are humans potentially capable of doing. As was mentioned, and as I've talked about, I was honored to be able to guide and lead the team that went after Nike's Breaking 2 effort, the attempt to run a sub 2-hour marathon. And before going into some of these ideas around human capability, I'm going to show this quick video which gives you an idea of how we were thinking about this.
It's not the absolute numbers that matter. It's picking the goal that you think is impossible. You know, it was just like the 4-minute mile. Why should it matter? You know, humans have 10 fingers, they like even multiples. That's probably part of this.
I guess all of these records are arbitrary in a sense. It's just because they become the next step in our sort of sporting heritage and development.
And I think that's where the 2-hour thing comes from. You know, why shouldn't we be able to do this?
58, 59, 60, 61, 62.
If a human body can do sub 2 hours, I think it would be the greatest moment in athletics.
Nice job, Elisa.
Okay, we have 1 minute. 1 minute till the start.
When you plot out world records, it should take a couple decades to get to where we want to be. But no one's ever gone flat out from the gun before. That's what I think is so amazing about this project, is we're going to tell these guys, you're going to go for it from the gun, and whatever happens, happens. And that, I feel, is a recipe for greatness.
I'm 100% confident in the science, 100% confident in this is mathematically possible and humans can do this. If it was easy, it'd be done.
There's no hiding from the clock. We're going to send you a long way, about as long and as hard as we think is physiologically possible. And we're going to see if you can do it or not.
Very nice, Elliot. Great job. Yours here today. Nearly there now.
It's about human endeavour. Why would you try to climb Everest? Why would you try to go to the moon? It's about the journey. It's about learning what our capabilities are.
It's about learning what our capabilities are. This is what we try to understand, is what are humans capable of doing? And then what can we do to remove those barriers? So let's talk about what humans are capable of doing. Again, using this running example. First one that we talk about is VO2 max. We know that VO2 max, or maximum capacity to exercise, is predictive of performance. It's shown here. These are relatively new data, 2021, but we've known this for several decades. This is 3K performance speed on the y-axis and VO2 max on the x-axis. There's this clear relationship between performance or speed and VO2 max. But if you take one VO2 max, 55 for example, someone with a 55 VO2 max could be running either 13 kilometers an hour or 16.5 kilometers an hour. That's the difference between way in the middle of the pack and winning. These are getting close to elite times. Okay, so VO2 max, although predictive, everybody who lines up for the Boston Marathon, I will see these data if I know their VO2 max. Okay, but within that, it's kind of hard to predict for one VO2 max how fast somebody's going to run. And if I take the fastest runners up here, that relationship generally goes away. This is a much, much less robust relationship when I take these fastest runners close to elite times in the same data set. Okay? So yes, VO2 max is necessary to be able to run the fastest times in distance running events, but it is not predictive once you have the fastest runners in that cohort. So there needs to be something else. We need to have, it's necessary, but there has to be something else to be able to predict this. So this is from a paper that we published around the 2-hour marathon race pace and what is physiologically necessary for that to happen. And what we postulated, what we found in this group of elite marathoners was that yes, VO2 max, in this case VO2 peak, was necessarily high. Okay? On average, it was quite high, 70-ish milliliters per kilogram body weight per minute of oxygen consumed at their maximum capacity. Some were up here closer to 85, but some were down here 62-ish, right? So wide range, but high VO2 max. What's also important is the sustainable intensity, or the percent at which they could sustain this VO2 max. So 92% was the average sustainable speed that these runners could have of their VO2 max. So even if they had a low VO2 max, if you could sustain 96% of that, that's pretty incredible, right? And if you had a low oxygen cost, that's another component, or running economy was very, very high, then that was another highly predictive when added to these other two things of performance outcomes. So it's not just you have to be high on all of them, it's the combination of all three and the interaction between all three that allow us to predict how fast somebody's gonna run. So we did that here with the runners in the cohort. Their average marathon time, they were not slouches, they ran about 2:08 on average, okay, which is quite fast. First thing you notice here though, and this is using those three components, maximum VO2, sustainable intensity, and running economy, to predict fastest marathon time. Okay, first thing you noticed is that they all should be running faster by about 3 minutes. Okay, they aren't reaching their true potential. They aren't reaching their true capability. There's something that's keeping them from doing that. Usually races are meant to be, you just need to beat the person behind you. You're not running a time trial. So they're not reaching their capability probably because of that for the most part. But they all should be running faster based on their capability. And you notice here that there's a few runners, 3 in particular, that are approaching potential to run a 2-hour marathon. And so these are kind of some of the data that we use to understand whether or not a human has the capability of running a 2-hour marathon, if we could just remove the barriers that might be limiting that. Another way that we look at this is we look at it from more what I call a bioenergetics model, okay, or understanding more in real time what energy expenditure and energy utilization is occurring, and how do we account for that, and how does that help us predict how fast somebody is going to run a race. So how we think about this, I just want to go into a little bit of background here. If you plot power on the y-axis over time on the x-axis, and I have somebody do multiple time trials as hard as they can for, say, 2 minutes, in this case 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, and if I have them do a couple more, I can draw what's called a power duration curve. And so that's what this is. It's a power duration curve. This asymptotes at what's called the critical power. So this is the highest sustainable external work rate that can be accomplished for long periods of time without appreciable fatigue. And by long periods of time, we mean like 40 minutes to 60 minutes. Fatigue starts to happen after that, okay? We can also get what's called a gas exchange threshold from like a maximal exercise test, a graded exercise test. And then we can define what's called the W prime. W prime is the work that somebody can do above their critical power before they become exhausted. So it's an absolute amount of work that can be done before they become exhausted. And that allows us to define these exercise intensity domains. So if you spend time in the severe domain, you are going to deplete your W prime. Look at this as a battery. You have a specific capacity of this battery, and if you're exercising in the severe domain, that battery drains. Once it hits 0, you're falling off the back of the treadmill, or you're sitting on the side of the road because you're pretty much done. Okay? So critical power is the highest rate of steady state oxidative energy turnover. Okay? This highest steady state or highest sustainable intensity. You'll hear me talk about it that way. Where W prime is capacity limited, how big is the battery? Because once that battery is run out, you're done, okay? So as long as you're below critical power, you're in this heavy domain, you can sustain that for a long period of time. If you're above it, your oxygen uptake kinetics go to max and you hit exhaustion, okay? So this allows us to define exercise intensity domains. So we're not just using percent of heart rate to define a domain that you're exercising in. We are using true physiological delineators to precisely understand what domain you're working in. It also allows us to predict fatigue progression quite precisely. So as long as they're in the severe domain, we can predict fatigue progression very, very precisely and know when they're going to run their best performance or how fast they're going to be able to run their best performance because of that. So it enables us to predict best possible performances or time to fatigue when they're going to stop. So that was critical power. We can also use this for critical speed because during running we use things like velocity and speed, right? So we can predict that based on the distance that somebody runs, plot out several times, and how long it takes them to run that, and we get what's called the critical speed and the D prime, or the distance somebody can run above their critical speed before they are sitting on the side of the track. So any runners out there, you can do this. You can take your PRs for different distances, and you can plot those PRs relative to that distance, and the slope of that line is your critical speed, and the intercept is your D prime. Okay, so you can get the speed. This is quite fast, by the way. You can get it's in meters per second. You can get your speed of that's the speed that I can sustain for long periods of time before I'm going to start accruing fatigue, okay? And how far you can run before that fatigue becomes impossible to maintain. So that can be done quite easily. So we can do that, and you can allow a prediction of time from total distance. So say marathon distance minus however far I can run above my critical speed, divided by that critical speed, and I get a pretty precise metric of how fast I'm going to be able to run that marathon. So we did this in a recent study that we published. I think this is 2021. Okay, we went in this case, it's the 2017 Track and Field Championships, the 5,000 meters. So everybody who towed the line for the 5,000 meters, we went back in time before that, and we used all their best performances, all their PRs, and we calculated their critical speed and their D prime. Literally did that graph that I just showed you. Okay, and this is their best predicted time based on these critical speeds and D prime. Again, the first thing you notice is these are the actual race times. They should be going a lot faster. They have the capability to go a lot faster than what's happening, okay, because they're racing this race. They're not time trialing it, okay? But they have the capability to do this faster, okay? And then we predicted who was going to win the race based on how this D prime changes. So it's great to know what happens at the starting line, what D prime is and what critical speed is at the starting line. But I just told you, anytime somebody runs above critical speed, they drain that battery, right? So that D prime, how much is left at any point in time, changes. Okay, so that's called D prime balance. And there's a lot of fuzzy math that people that know how to do this math do, and I just listen to what they tell me the results are. But what we do is we look at, now just to orientate you on these graphs, these bars are how fast the leader is going with each lap of a 5,000 meter race, okay? So the person that crosses the line first each lap is running this speed. These are an example. This is the first, second, and third place, as well as a couple others. These are how fast they're running relative to that fastest lap speed, okay? So every time the race is going faster than their critical speed, that is what the critical speed is on these lines, they're draining their D prime. Everybody see that? So anytime these bars are above these lines, they're draining their D prime. So you can see the first lap, all of them drain their D prime a little bit because it's all faster. Then everything slows down. None of them are draining their D prime for a while. But then people are starting to make moves. They're starting to race this thing. Okay, people are going faster, and the D prime starts to drain. So this is that battery. At the end, some people are done. They don't have any battery left. The perfect race is to hit zero right when you cross the finish line. That's the perfect race. You see some of these athletes left something on the track. They didn't cross zero when they crossed that finish line. So from this, we can predict finishing place quite precisely. This is using that D prime balance and looking at the final 400 meters, what was their actual finishing place. This is quite a steep prediction, quite a good prediction. Being able to understand in real time how much energy they have left to draw from, what they're capable of doing every point in time, we can predict quite precisely what their finishing time and therefore finishing place is going to be. If you look back at how well VO2 max predicts that, it's quite different. Okay? If we understand things in real time, how capability at each point in time, human capability at each point in time is changing, we could be much, much more precise than just knowing their VO2 max at the beginning of the race. It's an example of how this bioenergetics models can work. The thing that we have to think about, though, is we get stuck into thinking that, like I just suggested, that what we measure in the lab, like VO2 max or running economy, is always going to be the same. And we know now, over the last decade or so, that is not true. These are very dynamic variables. So understanding how resilient somebody is to change in all of these variables is something that we really are just now beginning to explore a lot more. How much do these variables change over time? How much does fatigue impact these variables? Because again, we know that at the starting line, if we've measured things in the lab, that's what they are. And again, we've always kind of made these assumptions that VO2 max is VO2 max is VO2 max. But at the end of a 2-hour race, we know now that that is not true. VO2 max is not the same. The maximum oxygen consumption might actually be the same, but the speed at which that happens is way, way lower. Okay, so fatigue happens. Okay? We know that critical power is not the same, or critical speed, I should say, is not the same. We know for sure running economy is not the same. So these factors change over time. One of the papers that we did, this is part of Ida Clark's dissertation work. We published it, I think it was 2020. Date's not on there, unfortunately. So what we did was we did these critical power tests, and then we had these athletes ride a bike for 2 hours in the heavy domain. So right below their critical power, we had them ride a bike for 2 hours, and then we did another critical power test. So here's our keep it in the wrong button. Here's our surrogate for critical power, or end test power. Okay, and we see that there's about an 8% drop on average in critical power from fatiguing exercise for 2 hours. That's a pretty drastic change. This surrogate of W prime, or work above end test power, drops about 20%. So though the battery got smaller, even though they didn't drain the battery because they were in the heavy domain the whole time, even though they didn't drain the battery at all during that 2 hours of exercise, the size of that battery changed. Okay, so this is important because as you're running or as you're exercising, even if you are at a power output that's below your sustainable power, over time you could just be above it because that value changes. That value drops, right? So even if you're staying the same, at some point in time you're going to be above it and you're going to be draining this battery, of which is probably smaller now than it was when you started, right? So these are very complex modifications that are happening in real time. So one of the things that we also looked at was, can exogenous carbohydrate ingestion affect this resilience? The answer is yes. We saw that we could reduce this heavy to severe domain boundary, so the boundary between the heavy and severe domain. We can reduce the changes, or we basically can restore that drop in that heavy to severe domain boundary if we gave exogenous carbohydrates. So this is 120 minutes, 2 hours of exercise with exogenous carbohydrate throughout versus just placebo. And this drop that occurred was restored if you were able to take on energy as you went. Probably had a glycogen sparing effect. And we've done some other work looking at glycogen. There is glycogen depletion that happens. Whether or not it's directly related to this drop in critical power, still an open question, but we definitely can mitigate some of this drop or this change in resilience with exogenous carbohydrate. So what happens, or where we are at the beginning, definitely changes. Okay, we know that VO2 max drops, economy drops. Now I just showed you data to demonstrate that the sustainable speed, or this heavy to severe domain boundary, that drops. Okay, and it definitely drops a lot by the time 120 minutes is up. So the degree of fatigue is going to be directly influencing this. You'll notice I don't have things. I don't really study neural drive, so I don't really know what happens with neural drive. We know that it probably goes up with fatigue because we have to recruit more and more motor units to be able to perform the task, right? But there's going to be a point where neural drive also drops because of the decrease in central drive. We know actually happens as well because of the peripheral feedback. So that's a bit more complex. And I don't study it, so I don't know what happens. That's why I have no arrows. So these variables are not static. We've made these assumptions for decades that they are, or at least we've pretended like we know that they are, but they're not. They're highly variable. They change. They're affected by a lot of different things, including fatigue. Okay? And this is a highly individualized response. We know that one person can change 1% in 2 hours, or another person can change 15% in 2 hours. So this degree of resilience, how much you drop over time in these variables, probably dictates performance as much, if not more, as anything. It's like just not letting these values drop can have a significant, and does have a significant impact on performance. So we're just now learning what are the physiological underpinnings and mechanisms behind some of these ideas around resilience. We've spent a lot of time over the last several years trying to understand these physiological boundaries. A lot because they change, and we want to understand how they change in real time, but also just what are the physiological mechanisms behind these things. Here's some images from our lab where we use near-infrared spectroscopy to measure muscle oxygenation as well as other NIRS-derived variables. We couple that a lot with oxygen uptake or other measures to be able to ask some of these questions. So we're really trying to understand, we know that the whole body oxygen uptake can describe these domains, right? We have steady state kinetics in the heavy and severe domain, and non-steady state VO2 up to max until exhaustion happens, right, in the severe domain. So, but that's kind of a hard measure to do. You can't really do it all the time. So we start looking into these muscle oxygenation values. And our ability to measure these via NIRS sensors. They're pretty lightweight. They're portable. You can put them on different athletes in different situations. And we found that the responses in these different domains mirrors the VO2 response, right? Which makes sense because we're measuring muscle oxygenation. So for the most part, it kind of mirrors this VO2 response. But importantly, we see this negative inflection that happens in the severe domain. So we started asking, all right, is that negative inflection consistent? And can we start determining or understanding this boundary between the heavy and severe domain, this highest sustainable exercise intensity, by understanding this balance between oxygen supply and demand? Because that's what muscle oxygen saturation is a measure of. It's how much oxygen is being delivered versus how much oxygen is being consumed at any point in time. So it's that balance. So we started going after these questions. And we found that, yes, this does mirror muscle oxygen uptake. And can we use this value, whole body oxygen uptake, and can we use these values to understand this boundary so that we can explore how do things modulate this boundary? If we're good at measuring this boundary, the physiological manifestations of this boundary, how can we start to look at some of the modulators? So this study done by Ian Matthews when I was still at Gonzaga and others, we asked the question based on the premise that if there's a positive slope in this muscle oxygenation signal or a zero slope in this muscle oxygenation signal, that means that there's a balanced O2 supply with demand or utilization, right? This signal's going up or zero, then there's plenty of oxygen supplied to meet the demand. If it went negative, then that supply-demand balance is mismatched. Something, either more demand or more utilization of oxygen relative to supply or less supply relative to demand. Something is causing a mismatch. So what we did was we had them work in different domains, and we plotted out this change in the slope, or change in the signal, which is the slope, and predicted where this zero slope would occur. And at that point, we postulated that that would be that boundary between the heavy and severe domain. And it turns out that it is. If you are looking at steady state exercise out to 30 minutes, we almost always saw these positive or zero slopes. Whereas non-steady state exercise, where they fatigued just below this boundary, we saw negative slope that ended in exhaustion before 30 minutes. Okay? So we could differentiate this boundary between the heavy and severe domain quite precisely using this muscle oxygenation value. So two things. One, O2 supply and demand is important to dictate this boundary. And two, we can use that measure to understand how factors may modulate this boundary. This slope is also directly related to the intensity of exercise that you are exercising above your, in this case, critical velocity. This is from a paper that Brett Kirby and I did in 2021, or published in 2021. So you can see that the higher this negative slope, or the steeper this negative slope, the higher a person is exercising above their critical velocity, or that boundary between the heavy and severe domain. So again, this allows us to predict fatigue potentially just based on how severe this slope is. So matched O2 supply and demand definitely defines sustainable from unsustainable exercise at this heavy to severe domain boundary. And more importantly, anything that contributes to a limit in O2 supply or changes energy demand in some way is going to affect this boundary. So any cardiovascular adjustment that limits supply or any mechanical change or energetic cost change that happens in the muscle that increases demand is going to affect this boundary. So this allows us to go after questions around, all right, let's go back to some of these modulating factors and understand how do these things really impact and limit performance when we look at these primary factors that dictate performance. So remember, these primary factors that dictate performance, now we're looking at how do all these things modulate it? How do all these factors modulate these primary performance limiters, especially this idea of sustainable speed? So the first question we ask is, does biological sex, or sex as a biological variable, impact this boundary between the heavy severe domain? Is there a difference between men and women? And the answer is yes. Half of you, maybe more than half of you in this room can tell me yes. Women are better, number one. Two, we prove that here. The women have a higher end-test power, or the sustainable O2 supply, balanced O2 supply and demand at this heavy severe domain boundary is higher in women when we express this value relative to their lean body mass. So we measure their lean body mass and express these values relative to that in a group of fitness-matched men and women, so they had the same VO2 max relative to lean body mass coming in. We see that something about women's muscle, when we're just looking at that and taking everything out, body size, out of the equation, is better at has this higher sustainable intensity. Cool finding. So now we're revising this to get it published as soon as, basically it's the next thing on my list to do when I get home. But so that's pretty cool data. So we try to understand, all right, what other modulating factors might be influencing this O2 supply-demand balance and therefore the maximum metabolic steady state. So that's really what we're looking at, right? Is we're looking at this balance between unsustainable exercise and a mismatch in O2 supply and demand versus sustainable exercise and balanced. To follow up on our sex difference study, we're looking at fluctuating sex hormones across the menstrual cycle. So what is it about potentially women's hormones that fluctuate? Men's hormones fluctuate, by the way, also across the same time period. Okay, so we're looking at the sex difference as well as fluctuating sex hormones across the period of a menstrual cycle and trying to understand how that impacts this line. We're also looking at gut microbes. So we know that gut microbes and the microbiome influences mitochondrial adaptations in the skeletal muscle. So this is going to be an energy side of this equation, right? Can we increase energy by having the right combination of microbes in our gut that allows us to maybe increase this value? We look at things like fatigue progression over time. We look at blood pressure challenges. So if we are limiting oxygen supply by changes in blood flow and delivery, that can impact this value. We look at skill acquisition, how much fatigue can impact that skill, age, hormone balance, perimenopausal versus postmenopausal versus premenopausal women. How does this impact this balance? These are all important questions. Cognitive performance and physiological resilience. All of these modulating factors are really what's driving the questions in our lab now, is using this O2 supply-demand balance as our primary metric of the highest sustainable work rate. So these are the things that we've been going after over that either myself or my colleagues have been going after over the last several years. And so when I put this back into the context of understanding human limits, it's important that we both understand what the human is capable of. What are we capable of as humans, and individually as a human? What is our potential? Okay? And understanding all those factors that might be barriers against us reaching that true potential. What are real barriers to us reaching our true potential? There are a lot of perceived variables, a lot of perceived barriers to us reaching our true potential. The more we can engineer situation and context where we remove those barriers, the more we will allow ourselves to reach our true capability. we are also intimately linked with our ability as humans to build tools and create technologies. When humans aren't able to do something physiological, like walk on the moon, we have the capability of building tools that remove the barriers that enable that to happen. Same with jumping from a balloon from space, right? We're able to build these tools. That's uniquely human to be able to build these tools and remove these barriers that optimize our performance. We cannot separate physical performances from technological advances and the cognitive performance that was required to build that tool. Okay? So those types of things need to be embraced, because if those things are embraced and we remove these barriers, I believe, like Elliot, that no human is limited. So, quick closing. Those of you who know this guy, okay, Brett and I did our PhD together at the University of Oregon, along with Lacey, who is now the editor-in-chief of Journal of Applied Physiology and pretty much runs the world when it comes to the APS. And so that time, those of you who are grad students and PhD students in particular, that time I say cherish that time, because you have those friends for a lifetime. Mike Joyner is my mentor and at Mayo Clinic, and definitely where I am today because of him, and then my team now at the University of Oregon. So I very much thank you for your time, and I know this was physiology heavy, but hopefully we got something out of it. Thank you. Great. Thank you.
All right, so we do have some time for questions. The venue has provided microphones in the aisles, so if you're uncomfortable with your volume, please use the microphones. For our friends online, you're encouraged to drop any questions in the chat, and Courtney or Deborah will ask. So please, what questions do we have for Brad?
Especially questions around what Brett was like as a grad student. I'll take those. I left out all embarrassing pictures. I had a lot of them. There might have been a onesie involved in one of them. Yeah, question. Oh. Go ahead to the mic if you want a question. I can, but I don't know if the WebEx can.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. For your sub 2 project, I was just wondering, what's your headspace when you're going into that? Where do you start? Very briefly. What do you look at? What?
For me or for Elliot?
Or for both. I'm sure you guys work together to do that.
Yeah. So we took it very much from an engineering perspective. So we said, all right, what is it? Again, just like I went through here. What are these humans capable of doing? That, for some reason, isn't matching what's actually happening. They're capable of going much, much faster. So what is it that's keeping them from doing that? So we literally sat in a conference room for a day, the whole science team, and we listed everything that could be keeping them. What are these barriers, these boundaries, that could be keeping them from doing that? And we set about saying, all right, what's going to give us the biggest bang for our buck? Meaning, is 80% of it here? Is 2% of it here? And we listed the top 4 or 5 things that we knew we could have an impact on that would account for 90% of all of it, right? We weren't going to go after a 1% change, because there's no bang for the buck there, right? So if we could affect these 4 things, these 5 things, weather being one of them, obviously we can't affect the weather, but although we tried, but it is Nike, they could maybe afford to affect the weather. But we could pick a time and a place where we knew exactly what the weather conditions were going to be like over a period of time, right? So these are these types of engineered perspectives to remove these barriers that we thought were limiting their ability to actually go fast. So that was our mindset, and then we went about doing that and figuring out how to solve those problems. Some of which were easy-ish to solve, like pick a time and a date. Some of which were a lot harder to solve, like how do we decrease their energetic costs over this period of time? If you have a bunch of people running in front of them, then we know that changes wind resistance, et cetera, right? So we were able to solve some of those problems. someone like Elliot, Elliot has taught me that when I came up in exercise physiology, we always had this thing that in a well-motivated subject, quote unquote, XYZ happens. And that's true. Like the physiology that happens in the muscle probably limits exercise in a well-motivated subject. Elliot changed my perspective on what that means. I don't think we have an appreciation of what a well-motivated subject is until you meet somebody like Elliot, who took himself to the depths of, and takes himself regularly, or did, before he retired, which I shouldn't, maybe he hasn't retired yet, I don't know, but he literally all the time took himself to the depths of being able to know what true motivation and true fatigue was. I think most of us have no idea what that is. And so having that mindset of really what a well-motivated subject is and taking yourself to the depths of not being able to recruit another motor unit is unique and takes a special place that you can go, a deep, dark place probably that you can go. But he had a very special way of thinking about training and thinking about life, and lived a very simple life. And put himself in situations where he knew he needed to suffer, because that's what he knows needs to happen to run a marathon that fast. And so that was a unique learning for me. That was a long answer to that question, but
Thank you, though.
Yeah, go ahead up to the mic if you can.
Hi. My question pertains more to grad school.
Uh-huh.
So being that the grad school that you went to played a pivotal point in where you are now, what advice or insight could you give to us who are going to be applying to grad schools very soon, just to pick the right one?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. So you should, one thing is that your grad school, this is going to sound bad. It's online and being recorded, right? It's good. I want to say it's not a death sentence, but it's also not. It's not. And I mean by that is if it's not perfect for what you want to do with the rest of your career, you're not stuck there. You're not stuck in doing that work. You're not stuck in being a part of that world. That world being that specific set of questions that your advisor is asking. You can take that knowledge, and I hope that you do. You should take whatever you learn in grad school, no matter where you go, and take the pieces that you think are the best and apply them to other questions that you want to go answer. So you're not set on those same set of things. So before I answer the question, just know that. You can't go wrong as long as you're interested in learning the techniques and learning the perspectives and learning the ideas that professor has. So that would be my recommendation, is go find that. Go find those things, even if it's a little bit outside of the area that you want to learn. Like I could have the vision beyond that to say, here's a technique or an idea that I think would be cool over here. I'm going to go spend 4 years there and become the best in the world at that, so that I can then go apply it to where I want. So look at it bigger picture than just this is going to be where I'm going to be for 4 years, because you have so much more life beyond that 4 years. I know it doesn't seem like it, but you really do. And so don't think this is the end all, number one. And two, explore what everybody's doing. Read their papers, contact them. I love getting contacted by potential grad students. I can't take any more, unfortunately, right now. But I love getting and I try to respond to them, so that because it's, and everybody's going to be like that. And so just get to know potential advisors, because for your PhD, it's the advisor that's going to choose you, and it's not necessarily the school. So those two things. Yeah.
Dr. Wilkins, I've got a few questions online. This one is from Hans Vandermars. First of all, he gives you kudos. Great job with your presentation. And then his question is, given the reality of doping, do you check for doping among your project participants when you study elite runners? If not, why not? And then would human capability in running not be impacted by doping?
It's great questions, of which I'm probably not going to. So For Breaking 2 was a sanctioned marathon. We went through all the sanctioning process to get it measured accurately and verified. And along with that sanctioning becomes doping regulations. So we did not, as an organization, and I say we at that time was Nike, we, as an organization, test for doping of those athletes, but IAAF did on that day. I was there when they did it. So that, because it was a sanctioned marathon, it went through all IAAF sanctioned processes, doping included. That's really the only time that I've been involved in elite marathon from the standpoint of whether or not we get into sanctions and things like that. To the follow-up question, absolutely yes. Doping influences human capability. We know that. And when I say we need to embrace technology, I mean everything but doping. So the way that I look at it is that there are technological advances that remove barriers that allow humans to reach their full capability. And then there are things you add to the system that increase the human's capability in the absence of removing those barriers. That's the difference. Technologies that get out of the way so the human can do their best is not doping in my mind. Adding energy to the system or adding something to the system where that you're increasing that human's capability with the same barriers, that's doping. So it's nuanced but important.
Okay, I got another one for you online. This is several of them. This is from Bob Wells. He works over at Atlanta Track Club, and his question is, with super shoes, doping, sodium bicarb, et cetera, at what point do we cross the tipping point where we're no longer measuring true human performance? Yeah.
These are questions that are age old, honestly. And so I'm not going to solve it up here. Again, that's why I just kind of go back to a definition of technological advances that get out of the way of the human's ability versus adding to the system. I would argue that quote unquote super shoes, I hate that term by the way, are allowing the human to reach their full potential. There's no energy added to the system in those shoes. Every bit of energy is put in by the human. You just get more out in a specific shoe versus another shoe. You lose less in those quote unquote super shoes, less energy per step than you do in a shoe a generation before it. That's not adding energy to the system, that's losing less energy. So to me, that's allowing the human to be more capable of what it is that they're doing. So I'll just go back to, we have to generalize and say we have to draw this line. Sodium bicarb is an interesting thing. We naturally produce it, all these other kinds of stuff. Like if somebody can take in a bunch of baking soda and not throw up or poop their pants, like great. Like then good for them, because that's a problem in taking those things. And so it's just, I don't know. It's going to be an age-old discussion, and not everything's going to be fair. Not everything's going to be a fair decision as to what's allowed and what's not. But I think that there's an important line that we have to understand. Yeah, let's go here. No.
Just to preface, this question is a little out there.
That's all right. I like out there. Yeah.
That's all? Okay. So basically, I was wondering, what do you think are the implications of testing children or human, just people at younger ages? Doesn't have to be 5, could be 12, like right around puberty age, and seeing like what their genetic potential is. We can go based off of their parents as well going into it, and seeing how that would impact the peak ability of human performance. Like how do you think that would be ethical, and do you think that we would be closer to reaching our true performance if we were, weeding things out at a younger age instead of having guys like me playing basketball?
So it's a great question. We know that genetics has an influence on performance. It's about 50%, give or take. Meaning that the other half is epigenetics, some environmental influence, some interaction, upregulation, post-transcriptional upregulation of proteins, or et cetera, that are going to influence performance outcomes. So it can be, I'm going to skirt your ethical question part of that first, but just from the whole concept of identifying somebody at 5 and saying this person, we're going to, because they're genetically quote unquote gifted, we're going to put them down this track. I think you have a coin flip chance of that happening. I think that you can take somebody who may not be as genetically gifted, put in the right environment, get the right epigenetic influence, et cetera, and get them to the same place. I think there's exceedingly high amounts of evidence for that. I go back to how I started at the beginning, which is access. The more access we can have to sport, the much, not even on the same scale of level, we will be able to enhance our collective performance as humans relative to picking out the quote unquote best of us and amplifying that. Access to everybody, we just remove all those barriers that allow the interaction of genetics, epigenetics, environment, coaching, all these things. We solve that probability problem, which is going to significantly increase our ability as a human race to perform at higher levels than just picking out a few of the best of us by one of those variables, obviously, right? So too many other factors, which for those reasons I would consider it not ethical. We're exclusion, by its definition, it's exclusion. It's excluding people. And that is the opposite of access.
Okay, I feel like this is a really good segue from even like the accessibility thing, because I find that a lot of times there's like this weird separation between if you want to be like sports or clinical health or public health and that kind of thing. And I really feel like expanding the physiological capability is something that can like branch all of those things.
Yes.
And so I was really curious with that being so kind of foundational to your approach, but still being in such like elite sports at the same time. If you've ever had any sort of like special population or clinical type intervention, even in that sports performance lab kind of thing.
Interesting. So, ish. So you're right. When I look at human capability and we look at things like VO2 max and sustainable exercise and energetic costs in particular, those things, I give the example all the time of somebody with severe chronic heart failure, getting up and walking across the floor is VO2 max. Okay, so that is their maximum capacity to exercise. And we can look at things like the sustainability of that. What is the intensity that they can sustain for long periods of time? And how much energy does it cost them to do that? And manipulating those factors is going to increase their ability to have a better life, right? So all of these factors, when you apply them to disease, and these power duration curves and speed duration curves, they fit with all populations. And by the way, across all species, they've done those curves on newts, on little salamanders, exercising, and they get power duration curves from these animals. So it's highly conserved across all species, and it fits it also fits in disease populations. So that's the first, I think first part of the answer is that even though is that everything that we do from an elite performer standpoint applies to somebody who has some sort of limitation in one or the other of these things, right? That we can manipulate it in that way. 2, we have asked questions, not clinical populations as much, but looking at how these modulating factors are going to influence these sustainable intensities. Like I said, looking at postmenopausal women, don't want to make it sound like that's a clinical thing because it's absolutely not. But yeah, but manipulations that understand that how these systems work, right? And then how that we may be able to take that information and apply it to other populations. I think it's very, very transferable the way that we think about this. It's not just for elite athletes, and we want to understand. We're big right now on in the lab. One of the big things that we're really looking at is performance across a lifespan. So what does performance look like across a lifespan, and how can we move that all the way up so that you're performing higher and higher and higher across your lifespan, as well as what modulating factors are happening, i.e. menopause or changes in testosterone as men age, et cetera, that are going to influence these across their lifespan. So we ask a lot of those questions.
Dr. Wilkins, I've got one more that might be a good wrap-up question, because several folks are asking online, considering all the major improvements and advancements we've seen recently that have led to world records and beyond, what are you thinking or seeing as like the next big technological advancement? Predict the future. Maybe someone here might fund it for us.
Yeah. That's a great question. So what's the next big technological advance? I don't necessarily know. But what I think we really need to understand is these resiliency questions. How do things change over time? We don't have a good handle on how physiology changes over time and how these capacities and these limits change over time. So if we can find things that help keep those VO2 max, sustainable intensity, keep those values and those variables higher for longer, then those are, I think, going to have the biggest impacts on performance right now. That'd be my guess. So yeah, anybody want to fund that research? I can write up a proposal by end of the day. Thank you very much.
All right, so that will conclude the 24 Metzler lecture. I think Mike definitely would be proud. Terry, thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.